As I mentioned earlier, JavaFX is an expression language. Everything in JavaFX is essentially an expression. What is an expression? Well, it's a chunk of executable code. These expressions evaluate to some sort of value. They can be combined, in other words, expressions can be combined to produce larger expressions. Expressions are loops, conditional, code blocks. All of these are expressions. In fact, we have many different types of expressions. Anything inside of a squiggly bracket or set of squiggly brackets is called a block expression. We have if-then expressions, for and while expressions, or if you will, loop expressions. Try, catch, throw, and finally are all considered expressions in JavaFX. There are also some expressions in JavaFX that we might see as something as simple as an operator in Java. We'll take a look at some of these. For example, work to be done on sequences, or instance of, or operations such as insert, delete, new, return, are all considered expressions in JavaFX. So looking at some things that one would expect to be an expression relative to Java, in JavaFX, let's take a look at a simple if-then-else type of conditional. This is an if expression. So if age is greater than or equal to 70, then do something, else do something else. We have for expressions. We have while expressions, for loops and while loops, if you will. Notice that the for expression also includes a block expression. The squiggly brackets are actual block expressions. The for loop is the for expression, or the for part of the for loop is the for expression. And yep, inside of JavaFX we also have try-catch blocks, just as one would expect inside of Java. Try and catch expressions are then included here at the bottom. Some different types of expressions, things that we may not see in Java or may not see in quite the same way in Java. Let's say, for example, we have a number 7 that is an integer type in JavaFX. We want to convert that to a number type, what we would call a cast operation in Java. To do that, we'll use the as keyword. So we have a 7 as number expression, changing the 7 integer into a number, in this case my number variable. We have some things that, or expressions that work on sequences. Size of, insert, delete. These are all sequence operations, if you will. Sequence expressions. Size of teams gives us the size, the dimension of our sequence of teams variable in this case. If we want to put a new team, the string cubs, into the teams variable, we use the insert keyword. The delete keyword is used to remove one of those strings from the team sequence. You'll also notice here in some of these expressions annotations to get elements in or out of a team sequence. For example, teams square bracket 2 is going to give us the third element in the teams sequence. Yeah, I said third. It's counting from 0, 1, 2, 3. Again, just like Java, everything is 0 based as far as sequence are concerned. Interestingly, if I ask for teams at -1, this actually would print out nothing. -1 is not going to cause an error. In other words, it's not going to create some sort of array or sequence out of bounds errors as we'd expect in Java. It just simply is going to go out and look to see if we have anything at the -1 position on the team sequence. And of course, there isn't anything, so that returns nothing. We can also reverse the team's sequence and reverse the order essentially of the elements in that team's sequence. You'll notice some fancy expressions here too. To access elements of the team's sequence, we can use one ... notation in this expression to get out elements from the second position all the way to the end of the team sequence and put that in a variable called contenders. And we have 0 ... less than 1, accessing all of the elements from the 0th position less than the first position. So in this case, accessing just the one element in our team's sequence. Now, data binding is a very powerful operation in JavaFX. Data binding allows us to create a relationship, if you will, between two variables. Maybe one of the best ways to see how binding works is to actually look at a very small and simple example. Let's say we define a variable called x, and we're going to set that to an integer value, literal 0. Then we'll declare another variable called y, and rather than setting it to a value, we simply bind it to x. Here what we've done is said that y is now always going to be having the value of whatever is in x. So as I print y, right after declaring y as a variable, I'd see that its value is 0. Again, that's because it's getting x's value, which is 0. If I should change x to 7, and again print y, now we see that y is 7. So y is bound to x. We can use that also with def. Var or def again allow us to define variables in JavaFX. In this case, y again bound to x, we'd see the same results. Some slightly more complex bindings. Let's take a look at a sequence. In this case, we've got a sequence called pres that is a sequence of strings, the presidents of the United States. If I ask to bind a variable called first presidents to the 0, 1, 2 elements of the pres sequence, what I'd find is first pres is always going to be the first 3 elements in the pres sequence. Right now, that would be Washington, Adams, and Jefferson. But if I chose then to insert the string Jackson into pres and then again printed first presidents, we'd see that still prints Washington, Adams, and Jefferson. Why? Because Jackson was set to that last element in pres. But if I reversed pres and now print first presidents, we'd see that first presidents is now Jackson, Quincy Adams, and Monroe. So again, we're binding in the same way we bind integers of the variable y to x. We're binding first presidents to a portion of the sequence of the pres sequence. Let's take a look at another little more fancy example. Let's say we define a variable z equal to 5, and then we have a function add 5, taking any integer and just simply adding 5 to that integer and returning it. If I bind a variable sum to z and add 5 to z, what happens to sum? Well, if I print sum the first time, as one would expect given the bind operation, its value would be 15, taking 5 and then adding it to 5 plus 5, so 15 in total. If I changed z to 10, we would take 10 and again add its original add 5 value. So that was 10 plus 15, giving us the value of 25. So we're using bind not only to bind to, in this case, a variable z, but also the original return value out of a function call. And even more complex binding, we can bind to instances. In this case, we're going to bind cust to an instance of customer class, the JavaFX customer class. When I do that, when I assign or bind cust to the instance of customer class, and then I go and change one of the instance variables, in this case change the name of the customer to Kelly, what happens? Well, this actually causes a whole new customer object to be created. So I get a customer now of Kelly, age 45, address Hugo, inside of the cust variable. But it's a whole new customer versus the original one created with Jim 45 and Hugo. However, I can also bind not just to the instance, but I can bind to instance variables. If I bind customer now to an instance of customer where bind is used on the instance variable, when I change one of the instance variable of the customer instance, I'm not now creating a new object. I'm simply changing the value of what the name property on customer or name instance variable on customer is. So we're doing a bind operation here that just allows us to bind to the instance variable values as opposed to creating a whole new customer object. And bind works with inverse as well. Inverse is a keyword that we can use with the bind operation. So when I bind x with inverse, what am I establishing here? A relationship that is two-way with regard to the x and y variables. As we've seen, bind, when I bind variable y to x, I'm saying that y is always getting the value of x. When I use with inverse, that makes this bidirectional. In other words, as x changes, so does y, and as y changes, so does x. So as I change the value of x, we'd see that y changes and prints 9. But as I change the value of y, x also changes, in this case, printing the value of y as 10.